how much VRAM do you really need then, right? So for professionals and those of you who run resource intensive programs, 8 to 12 gigabytes should be your threshold you want to be in. 16 to 32 gigabytes is for pros who do a lot of video edits or they stream at a higher resolution, do 3D modeling, game development, music production, and so forth, right? Now, starting with gaming, because that's essentially at a core, that's what we do here in this community, right? We are gamers. For gaming, 720 for 720p, right? A resolution of 720p, you're going to want a graphics card with at least 2 gigabytes of dedicated VRAM. That's going to even allow you to say boot up the game without any warning messages or errors popping up. For 1080p, you're going to want at least a 4 gigabyte a graphics card with 4 gigabytes of dedicated VRAM. 1440p 6 gigabytes, and 2160p 8 gigabytes or more. That's 4K. Now, this is essentially a rough roadmap, right? You can interchange these depending on the game you play and how you want to play it, right? 720p, say a 2 gigabyte graphics card that on a lower end, that could be a GTX 770 or 760 or a GTX 960 or an RX 560 or a 550, something along the lines of there. And then for 1080p at a 4 gigabyte dedicated VRAM buffer, you're looking at maybe like an RX 570, right? A 4 gigabyte RX 570 or a 3.5 or 3.5 gigabyte GTX 970. Again, depends on what side of the side of the fence you want to be on in that argument, but it's between 3.5 4 gigabytes. You want to believe Nvidia says a half a gig is reserved for onboard, graphic BIOS and what have you, but it is what it is. You can play 1080p with the GTX 970 quite easily. So if you're interested in gaming at either one of these resolutions, consider a graphics card, your next graphics card, or upgrading your graphics card. That could be adding a dedicated video card or upgrading to a faster graphics card. Now, 720p, 2 gigabytes of VRAM, okay, 1080p, 4 gigabytes, 1440p, 6 gigabytes, and 2160p, 8 gigabytes or more. I say or more because 30 series graphics cards are a little difficult to find at MSRP. You can get lucky. You can get one. You can find one, but it will require you to work. And depending on what RTX 30 series graphics cards you go with, chances are you will be above that 8 gigabyte limit, putting you in a position to enjoy obviously any one of these resolutions. But if you're with a graphics card that has 10 gigabytes or more of dedicated VRAM, then you are likely going to be in a realm of 1440p or 4K high settings, right? Somewhere in between there. So, what about, because I don't want to limit it to just gamers. So, how much video RAM would I recommend for my video editing friends or my friends who say stream and game, right? Maybe you want to, it's become more and more popular, maybe not as much now. It's slowed down a little bit. Could be as economies open back up. Humans want to get out and do things that don't require us to sit at a screen, but I am super introverted and I will always love to sit down and stare at a screen in a four-corner room or building. But for video editing, so if you're interested in either, becoming a YouTuber, or you want to be a Twitch streamer, or you want to say do this as a way to make money, say you want to edit other creators' videos or other streamers' videos, you want to consider for 720p to 1080p files at least a graphics card that has 8 gigabytes of VRAM, right? For 1440p and 4K files, at least 16 gigabytes of VRAM. And for professionals and commercial users who plan to edit 8K and crunch more graphic data, 32 to 64 gigabytes is essentially a threshold you want to inhabit. 4 to 8 gigabytes is enough to enjoy most games at a decent FPS, being that most users still very much game at 1080p 60 or on 1080p 60 hertz monitors. And then 8K files, again, 32 gigabytes to 64 gigabytes, which is not a lot of you in our community, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. So for the sakes of KISS, or keeping it simple, we're going to revert back to gaming. But do know that 8K is an extremely demanding resolution to work at, game at, just play at in general, edit, and even 8K monitors are not cheap. 8K monitors are not affordable by any stretch of imagination. For gaming, though, again, 4 gigabytes to 8 gigabytes is enough for you to enjoy, most of your games. Playable could be different to each of us. If you want the game to run at a respectable FPS, that should exceed the performance output of a console. If not, then you're really not taking full advantage of the different areas you can compromise on to improve your experience. Maybe Han's not content with, say, 50 or wherever the FPS output that he's at playing Cyberpunk. Let's say Han says, you know what, I'm just going to drop all the settings down to low, because at the end of the day, I'm still running this game at a native resolution of 1080p low settings, and that still beats the alternative of playing it on a console. I would say Cyberpunk 2077, especially on classic PS4, is probably running the game at either 720p or 900p, and that's just to maintain an FPS of probably around 20 to 22 FPS. When you're buying a graphics card, try to invest in a card that has at least more than 8 gigabytes of GDDR5 or GDDR6 memory, just 8 gigabytes of VRAM in general. Consider it not future proofing, but keeping up with the pace as games continue to become more and more complex. Investing in a card with 10 to 12 gigabytes of VRAM will put you in a better place in the future. So it's not necessarily future proofing, it's keeping up with that pace. So when the future comes, you're not behind, you're not past the future, you haven't future proof. You like future proof and concept. Let me switch back here, y'all. You remember what I said? When I say I'm switch back here, it's gonna get fire. It's not future proofing. You're not trying to, surpass what's to come. You're keeping up with what's already happening. So when the future does come, you're not behind, but you are right there. This is why investing in a card with 10 to 12 gigabytes of VRAM, maybe even 8, as a good starting point, especially if you're only interested in playing games at 1080p 60 hertz, right? And you want to play games like Minecraft and Fort and maybe like CSGO or Rainbow Six Siege, not as high, games that are graphically demanding, but that will put you in a position, even if you start with at least 8 gigabytes, that will put you in a position to run graphically demanding games even at 1080p, like Cyberpunk 2077. I digress. With that said, we're going to power right on through, because I was discussing, not future-proofing your monitor, or not future-proofing your setup, or not future-proofing in general, but more so keeping up with the pace, especially as games, in the subject of graphics cards or video cards. In the subject of video cards or games, being able to keep up with that pace will put you in a better position or place in the future. Not necessarily buying a graphics card right now that's going to say, oh, I bought my RTX 3080 or RTX, I have a 3090, or even if you bought a 2080 Ti, I bet you thought you were good for years to come. But then here came graphics cards like the RX 3070 that's faster, slightly faster for half of what you paid for it. So it's more so putting you in a position that you could say, you know what, how well will I be able to run games 5 to 6 years from now, right? Or 3 years from now. That's the goal. That's the key, friends and fam. So, third block. And this kind of brings together the whole entire, the broad spectrum of this conversation, right? And that is essentially the importance of VRAM for gaming or PC gaming in general. Now, remember on the live stream, on the live stream. Remember earlier in the live stream, I mentioned that, more VRAM doesn't translate to more FPS, right? Very important that we squash that misconception now. No, more VRAM doesn't translate to more FPS. But what it does mean is a smoother experience, right? In any application that benefits from said VRAM's abundance, right? The more the merrier, especially if you again want to run your games at a higher fidelity, rather that be 1080p. For 1080p, the recommended minimum amount of VRAM you should have is 4 gigabytes. The moment you try to turn up more of those graphic settings, the more VRAM is going to be needed to compensate for the extra detail and depth in each of those pixels, in each and every single pixel. It's 1920 by 1080, literally 1920 times 1080p. That's how many pixels. I believe is over a million. So as you change the pixel density of each of those millions of pixels, that strain is put on your VRAM buffer. One benefit to having so much VRAM, again, you won't get more FPS, but one benefit is that loading times, right, shorten. You can improve your loading times, right, by having more VRAM. Again, remember the purpose of VRAM is to store graphic data on your graphics card for it to be called by your GPU, by the graphics processor. So more VRAM will shorten your load time, and it also improves your image quality. That's what I was saying. Like even if you want to game at 1080p and you have an 8 GB VRAM graphics card, you're still well within the realm of possibilities of being able to turn up the graphic settings in most of your games at 1080p, right? But the the more you have, the higher the fidelity you can run your games, especially without drastically affecting or impacting your FPS. Man, I almost couldn't talk. Most games, especially modern games, will let you know that you are exceeding your allotted amount of VRAM, either on the bottom of your settings screen, or there'll be a message that pop up that tells you you can't run the game at that graphic preset, and the game may revert to its default settings, or settings that by default the game will recognize your hardware and will automatically set the game to a certain preset that will be playable for you. Then you can make any necessary changes along the way. Maybe you don't need high textures, maybe you're okay with medium textures. Maybe you don't want the extra detail in your foliage. Maybe you don't need the water quality set to high. Maybe you're okay with medium water quality, which I would recommend. And that's simply because unless you're playing a game like Sea of Thieves, a game that predominantly takes place on the water, don't eat up system resources by having the graphic preset, like say for water quality, turned up to high or ultra. If you need to compromise, start there, right? Disable any anti-aliasing technology like FXAA or MSAA, right? Any of those two, you could gain FPS by compromising in those areas. More VRAM though.